Okay, hello everyone. I'm going live tonight at a slightly earlier time. Just stuff is happening tonight. It's a bit complicated. Uh, the next week or so is going to be a bit crazy for me because we're changing the windows on Monday. So as you can see, there's a whole pile of stuff getting piled up around the place. Anyway, I hope everyone is well. Um, it's almost at the end of November. Days are really short, and they're going to get worse. It's dark and stormy outside, and I have to go out in a while. Um, anyway, so just before we get going, I have a video out on Innisfallen, the Abbey of Innisfallen in Killarney, in Loughlin in Killarney. So I'd appreciate if everyone could have a look at that and click like, leave a comment. It all helps. It all helps. And then I'm hoping sometime next week to put another video out. I'm going to try a different style. It's going to be on Elizabeth I and Ireland. Um, so hopefully that'll be out sometime. The script is almost finished, and I have some filming to do, but maybe early next week that'll be out. Okay, so welcome everybody. People are starting to come in now, and I thought, hopefully everyone can hear me. It's always hard to tell when you start up if people are listening to you. I thought I'd start tonight by discussing films and TV series and Irish history. I know there's a big hoo ha tonight because the last the the last episode, the last season of Stranger Things is start. I started today. My daughter and her friend are in the house watching it, and I'm hearing lots of laughter. Hi, Kira. Welcome to see you. Yeah, it's windy here, but from the forecast, you're going to be getting much more wind than us. We don't have a warning. We don't have a warning, fortunately, because we've had enough wind. Well, where I live, it's very exposed. It's up high and facing out towards the Atlantic. So when there's wind, we get lots of wind. So stay safe up in Mayo. Anyway, back to if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free drop it in the comments and I'll get to it. So I was going to start off by discussing some of the films and series about Irish history. One of the problems about being big into Irish history is that you find most historical films problematic. Like, for example, one of the most famous ones about Irish history. Two of the most famous ones are about the War of Independence, should we say? There's Michael Collins and The Wind That Shapes the Barley. Now, Michael Collins, I saw in the cinema many years ago. It's a reasonable film for Hollywood, but I think its portrayal of De Valera and a couple other things is over the top. Um, I'd sort of rank it so as a historical film. Um, I haven't watched it in years and years and years. One of these days, I might go back and watch it. The Wind That Shapes the Barley is quite a good film, but it had more things in it that really annoyed me than the than Michael Collins. Michael Collins was a Hollywood film and didn't pretend to be anything else apart from that. Whereas The Wind That Shaped the Barley kind of portrayed itself as historical representation of everything. Yet parts of it were complicated, especially it kind of make trying to make out the IRA in Cork to be socialist, which they weren't. Um, and then the portrayal of the Civil War was very black and white, which is very simplistic. And it kind of says that the Free State Army were the same as the English, etc. And sort of that the brother who stayed in the Free State side made him have to be a baddie. Um, In my family, my father's family, his father went on the Free State side because of his friends, whereas his sister, my great aunt, she went on the anti-treaty side. And they were both living in the same house. Well, it wasn't even a house; it was a tenement, a one-room tenement in Dublin. So things were complicated. Um, the Civil War was a very, very complicated period. The guy who made The Wind That Shapes the Barley, I can't remember his name now. I remember watching his film about the Spanish Civil War, and in the end, it kind of makes out the Republicans who took the kind of the Soviet side to be the same as Franco's side, whereas the Trotskyists were the good ones. They were. It's a simplification that I find annoying. Um, Another film that I found interesting, though I haven't watched in a long time, it's by Neil Jordan, the same director who made Michael Collins. It's Angel. It was made in the early 1980s. It had Stephen Ray in it, and it was very, very good. It was a bit bleak at times. I have a feeling that the end was bleak. Similar to that, there was a film, The Railway Station Man, with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie in it. It's based on a Jennifer Johnson book. That was quite good. Um, and if you jump way, way back, I think in the 1950s, there was an interesting version of Lemur Flaherty's The Informer, which was another good one. But I don't know, the Irish, I was trying to think about that today. Think of other films. I can think of series, but it, like there's a lot of films about Northern Ireland. There was one on Bloody Sunday. I have the DVD, but I never watched all of it because it's so brutal. It's almost like a documentary, as if you were there. Another interesting film, I think it's called 1973. It's about a guy who gets separated from the British Army in Belfast, and it's interesting in that it shows that there are two IRAs, and kind of most people are bad. There's complications. It's a good film, but when you think about Irish history itself, there's not that many good ones that stick in my mind. 71. That's it, Wayne. 71. I can never remember the year, the name of it. Um, I watched a bit of the one on the Irish famine. I can't remember what it's called, but I kind of found it very bleak because it was a very bleak time. Um, and I know there's always talks about a film being made about Brian Boru and or Grace O'Malley, Granuel. And I kind of dread those two because they'll both be based on ahistorical stuff. I remember years ago, way, way back, I think it was 81 or 82, RTE made a very interesting series called Strumpet City. It was based on a book by James Plunkett, I think the guy's name was. And it was about the 1913 lockout. And as a child, it struck me as historically accurate. I'd like to rewatch it and sort of compare it with the history, but it was a very interesting portrait of the lockout. The 1913 lockout has kind of vanished a bit from history. I must come back to that another day. And then a year or so later, they had another series called The Year of the French, which was about, Kira, you may have heard of this series because it was about the French who landed in Killala and then went to Castlebar. It was quite a good series. I just remember being a bit disappointed by the battle scenes because I think they didn't have that many extras. So especially the last battle, the Battle of Balnamuck, it looked like there's kind of 10 people on both sides. I think they spent all their money on the scenes in Mayo, and when they had to do the final scene in I think it's in Longford, they didn't have many people. Um, and like, yeah, I think apart from that, there's not that many good films or series about Irish history. If you can think of any, please let me know. Please let me know. Wayne, one question. Who do you think was worse for Ireland, Elizabeth I or James I? That's a very good question. Elizabeth I was a nightmare, and I'll actually be making a video about her. I've almost finished doing the script. I just have to cut it because I end up with thousands of words, so it'll go on for about 2 hours. She was a nightmare, a disaster. In terms of the number of Irish killed, in terms of her policies, in terms of her like not wanting to do anything to do with Irish, but with Ireland, not wanting to spend money, but being unwilling to intervene in the country. She'd let her officials do anything, including steal lots of money, set up their own minor lordships, create havoc, but she wouldn't intervene. So she was a disaster. In England, she is seen as one of the best, if not the best, monarchs. I remember 3 or 4 years ago, there's a famous history podcast. I like it. I have some problems, but I like it. The rest is history. And they did this series, and they had voting on it for the best British monarch. And I like it. I think they called like it was done like a World Cup. And I know there was Elizabeth didn't win, and you could tell that the guys who do it were a bit annoyed. But some of the British I remember reading about it. Some of the Telegraph or something was fuming. The person who got elected best British monarch was Ethelstan, who could be seen as the first king of England. I have a feeling that loads of Irish people voted for him against Elizabeth and things like that. So she was a disaster. James, at the beginning, he offered hope because, after all, he was very distantly of Gaelic descent. Secondly, he had tacitly supported Hugh O'Neill at times during the 9 Years' War. And he had a Gaelic question to deal with, and he dealt with it reasonably. He did some very bad things in Scotland, but he didn't want to go out killing all the Gaelic people. However, he believed he was in a weak position when he took over, when he became King of England and Scotland. And he therefore left Ireland largely to the English, despite the fact there were huge links, historical and geographical and cultural, between Scotland and Ireland. He left it to the English officials who had been put in there at the end of Elizabeth's period, and he felt like he couldn't do much about him. This was okay while Mountjoy was in. Mountjoy had gone back to England after 1603. He'd been made the Earl of Devonshire, and he was important. Except he then fell because he married his mistress. A bit bizarre, and that didn't go down well with James, so he kind of got booted out of the court and died shortly afterwards. This left Chichester. Chichester became Lord Deputy, and Chichester, he saw himself as the intelligent, the intellectual author of the strategy that won the war, the 9 Years' War. He wasn't. His strategy was basically kill everybody, kill all the Irish. Militarily, he wasn't particularly good, but first of all, he didn't like the MacDonalds because the MacDonalds had killed his brother in a battle that his brother had actually started. And secondly, he knew the North a lot, so he wanted to get a lot of land, etc. And he set about persecuting Hugh O'Neill. And he encouraged, for example, O'Conn, etc., to take cases against Hugh O'Neill. And this persecution included trying to get Hugh O'Neill's wife, the Countess McGuinness, to spy on him. And so there's a court case going on between Hugh O'Neill and O'Conn, and That case is going to England, and Hugh O'Neill is supposed to go over. And then, the same time, Maguire and Rory O'Donnell are getting very worried because they've been conspiring in a way with the Spanish, trying to convince the Spanish to get involved in war again. And the Lord Hote, who's operating on both sides, he knew some of O'Neill's sons, and he began to put out the word that Hugh O'Neill would be arrested. He may have told the Spanish ambassador. It looks like the Spanish ambassador warned Hugh O'Neill not to come to London. And Hugh O'Neill's kind of almost ready to go to London when O'Donnell and Maguire appears with the boat. And then, in a way, he kind of panics, and the idea is that they head off to Spain and come back with an army. Whereas the weather blew them into France, and then from France they were let into the Spanish Netherlands. And the Spaniards saw the importance of Hugh O'Neill. To them, Hugh O'Neill was too important. They couldn't let him into Spain because James was fuming, and the Spanish just wanted peace at that stage. So Hugh O'Neill was sent down, and the other lords were sent down to Rome, where most of them died very quickly from disease. Hugh O'Neill lives to 1616, and he's writing letters till the very end asking to be allowed return, even just with a ship, and asking for soldiers. At times he said, I just want to go back to die in Ireland. He doesn't. So he made a mistake in leaving Ireland, a mistake that Lord Hote contributed a lot to, the St. Lawrence's. I made a video about that last year. And then James triggers the plantation of Ulster, which changes Ireland dramatically. Ironically, James had used people like Hugh O'Neill to run Scotland for him. Hugh O'Neill could have been a great help to James, and James recognized this at the beginning. But he made a complete dog's dinner of it. And who paid for this ultimately in the end were, first of all, the Gaelic Irish and Hugh O'Neill and the peasants who stayed behind, and secondly, Charles I, James's family. If Hugh O'Neill had not fled, if the plantation of Ulster had not happened, it's very unlikely there would have been a civil war in England. It's very unlikely that Charles I would have been executed. So coming back to the question, who was worse? Elizabeth was worse in one respect in terms of the way she treated people, etc. But she died at the end, and when she died, Hugh O'Neill was offered very good terms. James I had a very strong chance to reformulate relations in Ireland, to incorporate the Gaelic Irish, the Old English, and the New English. He messed this up, and he triggers a path in a way that's still going on. So it's hard to say who was worse. I can say, like, from a emotional point of view, I'll pick Elizabeth. But if I'm looking at it more intellectually, I'll go for James. Now, Ciara, you mentioned the TV drama The Hanging Gale about the famine. I have never seen that. That must have been while I lived away. I have never seen that one. Is it an RTE? Is it an RTE drama? I don't know that. I'm going to Google it afterwards. Wayne, thanks. They were both bad. Exactly. They were. Mind you, I think most kings were bad. And probably most still are. Maybe in one or two of the Scandinavian countries, these days you might have a good king. But if you look at Spain, not the king who's there now, the king before him, his father, who ended up fleeing off to somewhere in the Middle East, in one of the Arab countries, because he'd been up to some very dodgy stuff. So most monarchs are not good. Ciara, yes, RT made. I'm definitely going to look for that. Dig poll. Yeah, Wayne, you're not a fan of royals. But Wayne, you have a king now, don't you? In Australia, just to be mean, I'm saying that. If anyone else can think of any other good TV series or films about Irish history, there was one I remember watching bits of on BBC many years ago called Elizabeth and Essex, and Ireland appears in it, and it's Glenda Jackson is Elizabeth, and they actually have the Irish speaking Irish, which I found very interesting. Um, and there was one in the 1940s. It's I think it's called The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, and it it's funny. It stars Errol Flynn. He's Essex, and there's a small bit of it towards the end in Ireland. The Irish part is completely underplayed because Ireland was dramatic, was central to the relationship between Essex and Elizabeth going bad. But I can remember because you can actually watch the Irish section on YouTube. So basically, you have a scene in court, and all of a sudden, this Irish soldier staggers in to the court in London, reporting on reporting on the Battle of the Yellow Ford, as if he had run all the way from the battle. And then you jump to this. There's about 5 or 10 minutes in Ireland, and they're funny. And then all of a sudden, Hugh O'Neill appears as a real caricatured Walt Disney Irish person playing a trick on Essex. And then Essex goes back to London. It's funny. It's funny that way. It's a classic, but it's a bit bizarre. Hanging Gale was a four-part TV drama about the four Phelan brothers during the famine. Yeah, I'm going to look up that. I'm going to look up that. Though I must say, I find it hard to watch series about the famine because it's a gruesome period, and yeah, it's just so much suffering, etc. Hi, Jesse. Good to see you. Good to see you, Jesse. Um, and I know, like in the 70s on BBC and ITV, they made some interesting stuff about Arthur and stuff like that, and about Romans in Britain. But Ireland never made that. There is one interesting series made in RTE in 1966. Uh, it's famous. I think it's called Insurrection, but it was kind of went on for 6 days in Easter week 1966, covering what like was basically I think it's supposed to be almost like a report of the 1916 Rising. It was for the 50th anniversary, and as far as I know, RTE never rebroadcast it. They put a lot of effort into it at the time, and then I think because the explosion of the Troubles, they didn't do much about it. And I'm just remembering that in 2016 they brought out another series which I liked. It had problems. Um, Maybe it was called Insurrection as well, but I know it was about, was it three sisters or three friends? Uh, One worked in Dublin Castle, the other was involved in the Citizen Army, and I can't remember about the third. And it's about 1916, and there's some interesting scenes of like the fighting near Mount Street Bridge was very well done, I thought. And I know that they made a few years later they made a second one about, I'm not sure it was about the Civil War or the War of Independence, but I never saw that. Kira, Hanging Gale was broadcast in 1995. Yeah, I left Ireland in 1993, and in those days, until 2000s, it was very hard to keep up with culture, with TV series, etc. Um, Hanging Gale stays with me to this day. Yeah, I must definitely look it up. I must definitely look it up. There probably are some other series and stuff like that because I remember when I was young. Again, Northern Ireland, Harry's Game was quite popular, in part because of Clannad and its theme tune, and that I think it could have got to number two in the charts. And those were the days when the charts was based on people buying singles. And I remember there was a bit, the BBC had a bit of a scare because Clannad were singing in Irish and they were going to go on Top of the Pops to perform. And then the BBC were like, "What does the song mean? What do the lyrics mean?" It doesn't really mean anything. They're just kind of they're just repeating a few words, but they were panicking in case if it was a Republican thing. In case it was a Republican thing. Now, I wanted to. Sorry, just have a sip of my tea. I read a very interesting article in the Irish Times. I think it was in the Irish Times during the week about the Boundary Commission. And it made me, it put a question in my mind. Why was the Boundary Commission such a fiasco? Because if you look at the negotiations over the treaty, and then when the Collins and them return to Ireland and there's the dull debates, and even during most of the Civil War, there is not much talk about the North. The main problem is the oath. Everybody seemed to believe that the Boundary Commission would solve the problem of the North because so much of Northern Ireland would be taken away by the Boundary Commission and given to the South that the Northern Ireland wouldn't be able to exist, and so all 6 counties would come in. I know that before the fighting in the Civil War broke out, Collins was sending a lot of guns and stuff up north, and the IRA in the north was very much on Collins' side. Now, the Civil War ends, the Boundary Commission is set up. However, it turns into a complete and utter fiasco. And this article was very good on pointing to some of the reasons. Part of the fault lies on the Free State side, more specifically the choice of Owen MacNeill as it was set up with, there was someone from the Free State side, someone from the Unionist side, and then a third person who's supposed to be a neutral mediator as such. Owen MacNeill, who was a very, very good Gaelic scholar and historian, was the Free State appointee. This choice was terrible. He was an academic. He wasn't fit. Well, fit is a hard word. He was definitely not the right choice for a job because he didn't report back to the Irish cabinet at all about what was going on because that was agreed on. Whereas on the other side, I can't remember the name of the Unionist guy. He was reporting back to the Northern Ireland government non-stop. And I think the so-called neutral mediator was from South Africa, either South Africa or Canada. He was not very neutral. And basically, the other two rang rings around MacNeill. Everybody outside Ireland seems to have known, at least the politicians, what was going on. And the report basically not only did not say that most of the Catholic parts of Northern Ireland could be put to the south. They made minor changes on the border, but it also recommended giving parts of Donegal, pushing them into Northern Ireland. And the Irish government, having heard nothing of this, the report is leaked, probably on purpose, and the Irish government suddenly sees this horror story that the Boundary Commission not only would not do anything, but it would be worse than that. Part of Donegal County would be given into Northern Ireland. So they panicked, and basically it comes down to there's an agreement made to sweep it under the carpet. And like sort of the Free State government essentially agrees to forget about it in return for a lot of the money that was owed to England, because when the South got independence, it assumed a lot of debt. So a lot of this money, this debt was written off, and boom, the Boundary Commission collapses. Um, so who's to blame for this? Many nationalists in Northern Ireland, maybe not so much at the time, but later and even now, they say, "Oh, that was the South stabbing the North in the back." Um, I don't think exactly was that. It was the Free State government was new on the scene, and it got run rings round by the unionists and other people. It was extremely naive, and they chose the wrong person. I also think that you can blame the Civil War for this, because the Civil War had such a devastating effect, I think, intellectually or emotionally on Ireland. Ireland had got independence, something that had been tried for hundreds of years and it always failed. And suddenly, most of Ireland is independent, but there's this civil war. The people who had fought side by side from, say, some of them from 1916 to 1922 are suddenly on other sides. Um, although the numbers of people killed in the Civil War or injured are not particularly high, the damage that was done, for example, the damage to the infrastructure and the blowing up of railways, in shelling, etc., was enormous. The government was, and then a lot of good people on both sides died. Um, and then I think it left us some sort of psychological scars, or like a general gloominess. If the war hadn't happened, if the Civil War hadn't happened, I'm fairly sure that the Boundary Commission would have been approached in a different way. If it had been Michael Collins going in there, it would have been a different story. Even De Valera or people like Lamass, it would have been a different story. So it's it was a chance to change history in a way, and it failed dramatically. It's kind of been forgotten about. If you do history, Irish history for the Leaving Cert, you read about it, but it's not mentioned much. There's a book has come out about it now, which looks interesting. It's a bit depressing to read because of the result, but it looks interesting. If anyone has any questions, just shout. Now, the next question I want to deal with comes from a long discussion I had as a result of one of my shorts. This person saw the short and he was arguing with me a lot. And like he was saying things, for example, like the British gave Hugh O'Neill and the other lords 30 days to leave to leave Ireland. And whereas I said, no, that's not true. And I gave him the name of a book written by a Gaelic poet who took part in the Flight of the Earls. But he says, oh, we just have a different approach. Um, so that got me thinking a lot about the idea of the ownership of history and of sources, because the history that we know, the history that's taught in school, the stories that we hear when we're young, they change quite a lot. Like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, oh, the Battle of Clontarf, it was Brian Boru against the Vikings. Now people say, well, actually, there were Irish on both sides, there were Vikings on both sides, da da da. Um, and people have got much better at interpreting and discussing sources. So it's no longer good against evil, good or bad. There are bad people on both sides, and generally it's the poor people who suffer. But I always wonder, why do some people cling so much to certain versions of history, to kind of stereotypical versions of history? Um, and I find it a lot, especially when I put out a short or if I put something like I put out a video on Irish slavery about the famine, questioning or raising some points that would clash with ultra nationalistic or very kind of romanticized versions of Irish history. People got very furious with me. Why are people so attached to history? And like you can show them that, the version they believe in is out of date, that there are facts that don't agree with this, but they it doesn't seem to get through to them. They tell me I'm making things up, etc., etc. So um it's just something I've been wondering about. Jess, you're asking. It may be a contentious question, but in everyday terms, does Northern Ireland people feel like part of the same culture to you? I.e., does the separation feel like a legality, technicality? It's a very good question. I remember driving to Donegal through Northern Ireland with my father, and we would have. This was before the big period of the building of all the big motorways. So we would have cut through Tyrone, and then crossed the border at Strabane again. And he said to me, I always feel like when I drive into the north as if I'm in a foreign country. Part of that was because, say, until the late 1990s, the roads in Northern Ireland were much better. Now it's changed, and part was because we were driving through a Protestant area, and like there would have been, it was summer, so there were a lot of Union Jacks about. But if you were in if you were like went into Armagh, into a Catholic area, it feels the same. Um, sort of, but I've met people from both sides, especially university, and like I would feel more at home with them, and I think they'd feel more at home with me than say if they went to England. I think there is a common culture that's getting more and more common. Um, but at the same time, like I spoke to loads of people in university, and many of them would say that like they would never have met a Protestant or a Catholic until they went to university because when I was in university from 85 to 88, and then I stayed on a bit doing other stuff in the university. Um, so those were kind of the worst days of the Troubles, in that there were big walls through West Belfast. Both communities were very segregated, and they would only meet in the university. In fact, sometimes they might meet, a Catholic from Belfast might meet more Protestants in Dublin than in Belfast, and vice versa. But at the same time, if you got a bunch of Irish people and a bunch of Northern Irish people and threw them together, say in Spain or in the United States, they would feel very at home. There is a common culture, but at the same time, like there is a difference between Dublin, the culture in Dublin, and Donegal. There is a difference between East Coast Ireland and West Coast Ireland. There's like a difference between working class Dublin, working class Cork, working class Galway, and rural Ireland, say rural Ireland of big farmers, and also there's a difference between a rural Ireland of the Golden Vale, of Kildare, of Meath, and then small farms in West Cork, South Kerry, parts of Galway, parts of Mayo. So they're like, to me, it is the same. There is the same culture. There are differences, but I think there's more similarities than differences. And I think that the newer generation are clinging on to, are finding more similarities than differences. Victimhood is a valuable asset to many, and history justifies clinging onto it in many cases. Yeah, there is that famous saying. I think he's a professor from Queen's, Kennedy. I think Liam Kennedy, and he created the idea of MOPE, most oppressed people ever. Now I know that's controversial, and I don't want to wander into modern politics. Um, but I spent 20 years in Brazil, and by God, the police in Brazil frightened me more than like I've seen. I studied OUC and the British Army in Belfast in 1990, 1989, and the police in Brazil are much more frightening. Um, it's funny in that sort of way. It's funny in that sort of way. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I wanted to talk a bit about the Munster plantation. Now, um, I had mentioned a few minutes ago about Chichester, the Flight of the Earls, and the Ulster plantation. Before the Ulster plantation, the Munster plantation was the most successful. Throughout the 16th century in Ireland, from Queen Mary onwards, there were a series of plantations, English plantations in Ireland. There were most of them were attempts. Like there was one in Laois Offaly. There was an attempt that barely got off the ground in Ulster. I think in the Clandy Boys. Another one in Monaghan, a small one in Monaghan. There was a few of them, and none of them worked very well. The idea of plantation more or less came from the Romans, because who probably got it from the Greeks. Because if you look at your classical history, if you look at Greece, you can see there's the island of Greece, but hold on, there's Greek cities everywhere. Like there's loads of Greek cities. There were Greek cities in what is now Turkey, what was then part of the Persian Empire. But Marseille, um, Sicily, and loads of other places were all Greek colonies. Um, so the Greeks had this idea of colonizing. Then the Romans kind of got it too, but in a different way. They attach it much more to the idea of empire. So you get your former soldiers, they've worked for 20 years, and so you give them land, but you'll give them land in a place that has been conquered. So they will go there, and they will turn this conquered area into Roman. Um, Machiavelli talks about that, and Machiavelli is quite in favor of it. It was something that was in the Renaissance was an idea that was quite popular. So the English, they're looking at the Irish, and at this stage, I'm also including the Old English. They regard the Gaelic Irish as people who desperately need to be civilized, educated, to be improved, shall we say. Um, and like the idea of humanism comes in a lot. So you'll find a lot of I don't notable. You'll find a lot of Old English writers in the first part of Elizabeth and more at the time of Henry. They are trying to talk about bringing humanist ideas to Ireland, educate the Gaelic Irish. Then along comes the Reformation, and the the Protestant Vertons, they were big into education, and sort of at first they were going to convert the Irish through the book, make them all into good Protestants. But that gets worse and worse and worse because it fails. So the idea of sending over a bunch of English people to Ireland becomes quite popular, and at the same time, uh, during this time, you have large numbers of Portuguese and Spanish going to the Americas, and for a while, and French as well. The French tried for a while in Brazil, around where Rio is now, but they got driven out. But they they had various on until the 18th century. They had important French areas, so that was a different type of colony coming along. Um, and I think it's important to note that until the end of the 1590s, the English were more concerned with setting up plantations in Ireland than in England. Um, so you have the second the second Desmond Rebellion in 1583. The last Earl of Desmond is killed. Now and then Elizabeth, because he's been declared a traitor, Elizabeth has confiscated his lands, and those lands are huge. They include a huge amount of County Cork, a huge amount of North Kerry, a huge amount of Limerick, and I think a few bits and pieces in Waterford and elsewhere. So it's a huge tract of land. So they have the idea, we're going to make this English. We're going to bring English people here. They can take advantage of the natural resources, especially wood, timber, and they're going to divide it out. We're going to plant it properly, and we're going to make this into a version of Little England. And at first, they start planning all this, and they have all these grandiose ideas, but it starts running into problems with the court system, because people who've been granted land are fighting over each other, and many Gaelic Irish who were on land which the English had said belonged to the Earl of Desmond are saying, no, our land didn't belong to him. The last McCarthy Moore, Donald McCarthy Moore, who's also Earl of Cloncair, was quite successful that way. There were parts of land near, it's called Cushmain, which is near Killarney, sort of Killarney-Culloden way, and that was confiscated. And he went to court, and he won in court, because it was held by some Gaelic lords who the English said were Desmond supporters. He said, no, they were bad people, but that's my land. They were renting land off me, and he won. But a large amount of land gets confiscated. Certain people, like Boyle, Spencer, and others, they get given nice parts of land. And then some of them, Boyle especially, begins to hoover up more and more land. But between the mid 1580s and on 1598, you have several thousand English have come to West Munster. Like towns like Mallow are getting quite big, and it looks like it's being very, very successful. And there's all sorts of rules that they were supposed to live in houses that were defendable, etc., etc. Spencer, who he was an official, he was also a poet. He may have, you could say that after Shakespeare and perhaps Marlowe, he was the next most important writer in the 1580s and 1590s in Elizabethan English. His main poem is huge. He never finished it. It's called The Fairy Queen. If it's hard to read because it's full of allegory, etc., and it's the more you read about it, the more you read into it, the more you understand, the less you like it, because it's about killing everybody, essentially. And he got himself a castle and some land. And Spencer himself was all into killing the Irish. So whereas I mentioned a few minutes ago that initially the idea had been about reforming them through the book, from the rebellion onwards, it was reforming them to the sword, i.e., killing everybody, educating them by killing them. So to bring civilization by the sword. So the English think it's gone well because you have several thousand people here. But then in 1598, in August 1598, is the Battle of the Yellow Ford. A few weeks later, Hugh O'Neill sends essentially a raid into Munster. And it's under one of his illegitimate son, Con, Rory O'Moore, and another couple of people. And essentially, as soon as they They go into Tipperary and they burn a few of Ormond's places, and then they cross into Limerick. And essentially, as soon as they go into Limerick, the English panic. The English didn't have many soldiers, and it was one of the Norris brothers who was in charge of them, and he got his men, or he was told that there were thousands and thousands of Irish around, and so he says, "I'm not hanging around." He heads back, and then essentially the entire Munster plantation runs. They, like, some of them take refuge in castles. The rest start running for Cork. And then there's uproar because you have people, many Gaelic Irish who had been treated badly, maybe shoved off their land. They start saying, "Oh, look, there go all those English," and they start robbing them, etc. The English were saying that there was huge massacres. There weren't. One of the most common atrocities, if you'd call it as such, was that the Gaelic Irish would strip the English. In a way, I think this was kind of revenge for being like, "Oh, the English call us barbarians, so we take off their clothes, we leave them naked in the middle of Ireland. So who are the civilized ones? Who are the barbarians?" Um, the problem with that was it was heading into winter and getting cold, so many of these people would die of cold. But not many were murdered as such. Most fled to Cork, and then you have a whole pile of writings from them, uh, and several important writings. One of which may be by Spencer. We don't really know, and it's horrendous to read because it's real mad evangelical, heavy writing in which they blame everybody but themselves for their misfortune. They say, "Oh, like, sort of, the the somebody, God didn't like us, God was angry with us, and He punished us." Whereas what saved them was the actions of the Earl of Ormond. He was um, Irish. Well, he was Old English as such, but many would have considered him Irish. He was Irish speaking. He acted unlike the English. He acted very swiftly, and he saved some of the towns. But in 1598, overnight, this big plantation collapses. Now, there are, or in 1922, there were a lot of Protestants in certain areas, say of Cork. I have a feeling most of those were not descendants of this plantation, but of from Cromwellian and later, because after 1650, the land ownership changes dramatically. So there's a big change, but I can come back to that another day. Yeah, Dennis, I had to move the time back. I have to go out in a short while, just having a bit of a crazy week. Having a crazy week. Jesse, you said something before I began to go on my ramble about the Munster plantation there. Comparable to crossing the border between England, Wales, or Scotland, perhaps. There's a historical distinction and cultural, but there's a tentative camaraderie there as Britons. Yeah, like, to me, if I go to Scotland, I'll feel quite at home there. The same probably with parts of Wales. With England, less so. I'd say in the north of England, I feel okay. In London, okay, but say I went down to the real Tory voting, or now Reform voting parts, this real Margaret Thatcher people, I don't feel well there. And like, there hasn't been a hard border in Ireland in many years, and if you're in the Irish Midlands and you want to go to Donegal, you're going to drive through Northern Ireland, and until the early 1920s, Ireland had a different time zone from England. Ireland was half an hour behind England. So when it was 11 o'clock in England, it was 10 in Ireland, which makes sense in terms of position, um, of the sun, etc. But in it had covered all of the island of Ireland until 1914, and then the English government fiddled with it. I think it suspended it for the First World War because it wanted everybody on the same time zone. Not to, I presume, not to get people confused if there were military things going on. And then, as far as I know, in 1922, Dublin began to use it, but Northern Ireland didn't. And then it just created too much problems, because people along the border areas, they'd cross and recross the border a huge amount of time. Like if you're in Derry City is at the very bottom of the Inishowen Peninsula, which and it mostly Donegal is its hinterland, uh, and so people be crossing the border, and they would get very very confused with time because and also because of the geography. Parts of Southern Ireland are more to the north of than Northern Ireland, and you'd be going east west, and your watch would be going forwards and backwards. So I think after a year or so, they just got rid of Irish time, um, it's something it's very forgotten. But we used to have our own time zone here. Jesse, it's understandable. As a Yorkshire man, I feel completely alien in the south of England, London particularly. London, I think, is like, because I think it depends where you go in London. Like in North London, for me, because traditionally there were so many Irish in North London. And it feels quite at home. But other parts, like I remember being in Finchley and finding it very strange there. Um, and I'm sure, yeah, London is international. But if I went to what's that part, the posh place where they all go to, the Cotswolds, etc. I don't even know where that is. I just know the name. I would not feel very at home. Like I, I have never. When I was in school, we had to read a novel for the Leaving Cert. I read. My year was lucky. We read Wuthering Heights, which I related to. The year below me, they had to do Jane Austen, and Jane Austen is, I don't know, I've never clicked with her writing. It's very much something alien to me. This like upper middle class English society of the early 1800s. Whereas Wuthering Heights, which was set it's somewhere in the north. My English geography gets a bit complicated at times. Don't knowable. London's a big mixture. I agree with you. Voted Remain too, which is against the grain of many of the surrounding counties. I think, yeah, yeah. I've never really been down to the very south of England. I'd like to go down to Hastings, for example, to see the battle site and to see. I like some parts of Saxon history. There's the stuff I'd like to visit, but I think the people would be a bit funny. Here, I love Wuthering Heights. I love Marie Edgeworth. I never read her, and when I was in school, she wasn't on the Leaving Cert curriculum at all. I remember my history teacher talking about her in primary school, and then no one mentioned her at all. Um, Alien to the native Southern English London. Yeah, yeah, uh, yeah. It's funny. It's funny. The she should have been taught to us in school. Indeed, indeed. I don't know if the Leaving Cert curriculum has been taught. I loved the Irish. I did honors Irish, and I loved the literature part of that. I loved the history of the tongue. I loved the poems. I loved Tyriok Dermot Gurgus Grania. Um, Duel, which was it by O'Dearon or O'Riordan, which were lovely short stories. The one thing I hated was Peg. Um, sort of, it's not a story that's good for teenagers. But I felt that the Irish curriculum was very good. Whereas in English, okay, I liked Shakespeare, we did King Lear, so that was an interesting one. The novels, I can't remember what we did. Um, uh, I can't remember what we did. Dennis, Warwick Castle in England is like going to Disneyland. It wasn't great. Wow, I didn't know that. I thought that was a big medieval castle. I remember many years ago, I would have been about 13 or 14 in the Scouts, and we went to Leeds Castle, which was somewhere in the very south of England, but it's not in Leeds, and it didn't strike me as a nice castle because it looked so comfortable, and you weren't like it was. I'm not sure if there were people living in it, but you could have lived in it. It was a very comfortable castle, more like a chateau. But I always thought that Warwick Castle, in those big castles, were like, I know the big castles in Wales, most of which are in ruins. They are very much what I think of like castle, like Trim Castle, etc. I think it's just how okay, Dennis, it's just how they told the story. It was a bit childish. Okay, the castle itself isn't impressive. Yeah, sometimes the stories can be told badly, but sometimes I just walk in. If I'm visiting a place, I might just ignore the story. And something I find interesting is how many European castles were reconstructed in the 19th century. Like near Lisbon in Portugal, what's it called? I It's a town just above Lisbon, and they have a huge castle that goes back to the Moors there. But the king rebuilt it in the 19th century, and like it's a lovely castle. But you're kind of walking around. I walk around and wishing I wish the king hadn't touched this. The original castle would have been much more interesting. Castles are funny things. I took to calling a medieval castle overlooking a village I lived in France, the military base. It wasn't appreciated. Yeah, castles are funny. Ireland has loads of small castles. It has a few big castles, and most of the Irish castles have huge holes in them. They were damaged at some stage. Whereas, say in France and parts of England, the castles got upgraded by the aristocracy. They become chateau, etc. And sort of you have a building, and they will say, "Oh, this family have been living here for 1,000 years." But to me, it doesn't look like a castle anymore because it's got loads of windows, etc. It comes down to a question of what is a castle, which I think I'll have to return to another day because I'm running out of time now. Um, yeah, I better start finishing up because I have to go out in this dark, dreary night. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a video out at the moment on Inishfallen Abbey. So if you haven't watched it, if you can have a watch, leave a like, a comment, it always helps. And then next week, I'm not sure what time I will do this next week. It's just because I'm involved in several different things and my daughter does sports. So getting one day free every week is very difficult. But hopefully next Tuesday or Thursday I'll have this on again. And I'm working on a video about Elizabeth I and Ireland. Hopefully sometime next week I'll have that one out. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. And I will talk to you next week. Thanks, Wayne. Bye bye. Thanks, Jesse. Glad you thought provoking as always. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Mike. Arrived late. Will watch from me. Yeah, I had to start early this week. Next time it'll be back at 7. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye. Bye bye. Slán. Thanks, Kira. Thanks, Dennis. See you all.